Hey everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive with us. Today we're tackling something I think we can all relate to, at least a little bit. Anxious niceness.
Anxious niceness.
Yeah. Have you ever found yourself being like extra nice when you're feeling kind of awkward or stressed out?
Oh, yeah, totally. Like when you're trying a little too hard to make a good impression.
Exactly. And that's what we're going to be exploring today. And for this one, we're turning to the work of social psychologist Tessa West, who has a really insightful TED Talk on this very subject.
Okay, a TED Talk. Cool. So what does this Tessa West have to say about anxious niceness?
Well, she's done all this research on what she calls uncomfortable social interactions, and her work reveals these fascinating links between, like, our stress responses and our behavior, especially when it comes to giving feedback.
Interesting. So is she saying that stress makes us nicer?
Not necessarily. It's more nuanced than that, and that's what makes it so interesting. She's found that being too nice can actually backfire, especially in the workplace. And we're going to dive into all that today, like why this happens and how we can learn to give and receive feedback that's both honest and actually helpful.
I'm in. So where do we start?
Well, to really appreciate West's insights, we have to kind of understand her approach. She's all about using science to understand these everyday interactions, which I think is super cool.
Science. To study niceness.
Right. She actually sets up these experiments in a lab setting where she can observe people's body language, analyze the words they use, and even measure things like their heart rate and blood pressure, all while they're interacting with each other.
Wow, so they're like hooked up to monitors and stuff while they're just chatting.
Yeah, pretty much. And it's amazing what she's able to uncover by actually measuring those physiological responses.
So it's not just like guessing or speculating. She's actually got data to back it up.
Exactly. And that data reveals some pretty surprising things about how our bodies react in social situations, especially when we're feeling anxious.
Okay, you've definitely piqued my curiosity. I'm ready to hear more about these findings.
All right, well, let's start with this idea of anxious niceness. What exactly is it, and why is it something we should even be paying attention to?
Yeah, I mean, isn't it always a good thing to be nice?
That's what's so interesting about West's work. She challenges that assumption. She defines anxious niceness as this tendency to be overly nice, even if it's not totally sincere when we're feeling those feelings of anxiety or discomfort.
So basically, we're putting on a show of niceness to cover up our own awkwardness.
In a way, yeah. And she's found that while this might seem harmless on the surface, it can actually lead to some unintended consequences.
Unintended consequences. Okay, now I'm really intrigued. Like, what kind of consequences?
Well, one of West's most compelling findings is that this anxious niceness often shows up when there are these power dynamics at play, particularly in interactions with people from marginalized groups.
That makes sense. You'd probably feel more anxious in those situations.
Right, and West suggests that this over-the-top niceness can stem from this underlying fear of appearing prejudiced.
So you're trying extra hard to be nice to prove you're not biased.
It seems like that's what happens, yeah. But ironically, this can actually make things more awkward and uncomfortable for everyone involved.
Oh, wow. I could see how that would be a problem. So it's not just about our own anxiety. It's like our anxiety is actually impacting the other person too.
Exactly. And that's
Yeah.
one of the key takeaways here, being aware of not just our own anxiety, but also how our behavior might be impacting the people we're interacting with.
That's a good point.
Yeah.
It makes you stop and think about the energy you bring to your interactions, right? Like if your anxiety is actually affecting the other person, it raises the stakes for managing your own stress.
Totally. It's all about that self-awareness. But okay, so if anxious niceness is more than just being polite, what are some of the actual downsides? Like, is it really that bad to be overly nice, even if it comes from a good place?
Well, West argues that it can be detrimental, especially when it comes to giving and receiving feedback.
Okay, feedback. Got it.
Think about it. If you're constantly on the receiving end of this kind of vague, overly positive feedback, it can be hard to know where you really stand.
Yeah, like you don't know what you're doing well or what you need to improve.
Exactly. It creates this cycle of uninformative feedback that ultimately hinders growth.
Makes sense. I mean, how are you supposed to grow if you're not getting any real constructive criticism?
Right. West actually shares this anecdote in her TED Talk about a student who had poured hours into preparing for a presentation, meticulously crafting each slide and rehearsing over and over.
Oh man, I've been there, spending way too much time on a presentation.
Haven't we all? But the point is, this student, after all that hard work, she receives nothing but generic praise for her presentation.
Ouch. It's got to be deflating, right? Like all that work for nothing.
And that's West's point. The student ended up feeling completely unseen and her efforts unappreciated. She walked away not knowing what she did well or what she could improve for next time.
Yeah, that's rough. You put all that work in, and it's like no one even noticed the details or the thought you put into it. So, what's the alternative? Are we supposed to just be brutally honest all the time?
Not exactly. It's not about throwing niceness out the window altogether. It's about finding a balance between honesty and kindness. West emphasizes the importance of reframing the feedback conversation.
Reframing the feedback conversation. Okay, I'm listening. How do we do that?
Instead of just saying do more or do less, she suggests focusing on giving specific examples and offering alternative behaviors. She uses this really great analogy about cleaning a messy bedroom.
Hold on, a bedroom analogy. Okay, I'm intrigued. Tell me more.
Well, imagine walking into a messy bedroom. Would you just tell someone their room's a disaster and leave it at that?
Probably not, no.
Right. You need to offer solutions, not just criticisms. It's about giving them a clear path to improvement. So instead of just saying, hey, there are clothes all over the floor, you can say, hey, maybe try using that hamper over there for your clothes.
Right. It's about offering solutions, not just criticisms, giving specific actionable steps for improvement. And this applies to all sorts of feedback, whether it's about someone's communication style or work habits or anything else, really. It's all about being clear and concise and constructive.
Okay, that makes total sense. So it sounds like this replacement behavior concept is key to giving better feedback. But what if we're on the receiving end of anxious niceness? How can we encourage people to be more direct and honest with us?
That's a great question. You can't force someone to be blunt with you, but there are subtle ways to kind of encourage more constructive feedback. Instead of demanding directness, you could try asking some clarifying questions. Clarifying questions, okay.
Yeah. Like if someone says, great job overall, you could respond with, what specifically stood out to you? Or, is there anything you think I could improve on for next time?
So you're not putting them on the defensive, you're just gently nudging them towards more specific insights. I like that.
Yeah. And it's important to remember that it's a two-way street. If we want to receive honest feedback, we need to be open to it and create a safe space for people to share their thoughts.
Even if those thoughts aren't always positive.
Exactly. Wes talks about this too, how important it is to acknowledge the feedback even if it makes you uncomfortable. A simple, thank you for sharing that with me can go a long way.
It shows them that you value their opinion, right? Which makes them more likely to share constructive criticism in the future.
Exactly. And as we become more comfortable with giving and receiving this kind of constructive criticism, we actually start to see the benefits. It can lead to improved performance and stronger relationships, and just a greater sense of trust and respect, especially in the workplace.
That makes sense. So it's not about avoiding uncomfortable conversations, it's about leaning into them in a way that helps everyone grow.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
This makes me think about Wes' personal story, the one where she talked about getting feedback on her public speaking style. She admitted feeling that initial pang of anxiety, but ultimately the feedback was delivered with kindness, and it was focused on specific things she could improve. She even said that the feedback ended up being quite valuable to her in the long run.
Right. That story is a great example of how we can deliver feedback in a way that's both honest and helpful. It really highlights the main takeaway here, that it's not about getting rid of niceness altogether. It's about finding that sweet spot where honesty and kindness intersect.
Yeah.
We can be direct and constructive without being harsh or dismissive.
It's about approaching feedback as an opportunity for growth and improvement, both for ourselves and for the people we're giving it to.
That's a great way to think about it. It's not about tearing people down. It's about helping them build themselves up.
It sounds like it all comes down to intention, right? Anxious niceness comes from a place of avoiding discomfort, while constructive feedback is about genuinely wanting to help someone grow.
You hit the nail on the head. It's about shifting our mindset from, how can I make this less awkward for me, to, how can I give feedback that truly benefits this person?
Such a powerful way to reframe it. It kind of turns feedback from a chore into a valuable gift. Speaking of gifts, have you ever received feedback that felt more like anxious niceness than a genuine attempt to help you improve?
Oh, absolutely. It happens to all of us. I remember working on this project, and when it was done, I got feedback that felt very sugar-coated. They focused on all the positive aspects, but it felt hollow and ultimately unhelpful.
Did it make you wonder if they really understood the project or were just trying to avoid a difficult conversation?
Exactly. I left that meeting feeling more confused than enlightened, and that's the real danger of anxious niceness. It masks the genuine feedback and prevents us from truly learning and growing.
So how do we break free from this cycle of anxious niceness and start giving more constructive feedback? West suggests starting small to reduce anxiety and build comfort with giving and receiving constructive criticism. Have you found that to be a helpful approach?
Absolutely. It's a great way to ease into those tougher conversations. Instead of diving right into sensitive topics, start by giving feedback on more neutral aspects, things that aren't likely to trigger strong emotional responses.
Like what? Give me an example.
Think about things like the order of points in a presentation or the font choice in a document. It allows people to practice giving and receiving more specific feedback in a lower stakes environment.
It's like dipping your toes in the water before jumping in the deep end. It gives you a chance to build confidence and create a culture where honest feedback is seen as valuable, not something to be feared.
That's the goal. And speaking of creating a culture of feedback, it's important to remember that it's not just about what we say, but how we say it. West emphasizes the importance of delivering feedback with kindness and a genuine desire to help.
This all makes me think back to West's anecdote about receiving feedback on her public speaking style. Despite feeling that initial anxiety, the feedback was ultimately delivered thoughtfully and focused on specific, actionable improvements. She even mentioned that the feedback ended up being quite valuable to her in the long run.
Yes, that anecdote perfectly illustrates that killing niceness isn't the goal. It's about finding that balance between authenticity and empathy, where feedback is viewed as a tool for growth and development rather than a personal attack.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. Let's recap the key takeaways from our deep dive into anxious niceness.
We started by exploring how anxiety can trigger that tendency to be overly nice, especially when we feel uncomfortable or uncertain. We discussed how anxious niceness, while often well-intentioned, can actually be detrimental. It can hinder clear communication, limit growth, and even potentially damage reputations.
We also talked about West's recommendations for moving beyond anxious niceness, which include reframing the feedback conversation, focusing on specific examples and replacement behaviors, and starting small with more neutral feedback to build comfort and confidence.
And most importantly, we emphasized that it's not about being mean or throwing niceness out the window. It's about delivering honest feedback with kindness and a genuine desire to help others improve.
So, as we wrap up this deep dive into anxious niceness, I want to leave you with a thought provoking question. Think about your own workplace or even your personal relationships. Where do you see anxious niceness playing out? And how might applying some of West's strategies lead to more honest and ultimately more helpful interactions?
It's definitely something to reflect on. And remember, it's not just about receiving feedback, it's also about giving it. We all have a role to play in creating a culture where honest, constructive feedback is the norm.
Couldn't agree more. Thanks for diving into this topic with us. Until next time, keep those conversations real, folks.